Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah and welcome to another episode of Pivot here on Hilal TV. With me today is my guest Khwezi Mabasa, who is the Economic and Social Policy Program Manager at Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. I hope I've said that correctly. His work mainly focuses on labor studies, political economy and racial capitalism. Khwezi is a very good friend, he's a colleague, and perhaps is one of those individuals whom I can genuinely say is the first person that I basically took my political schooling from. So we value his advice, his analysis, and we really welcome him and thank him for making this time to be here with me today on Pivot on Hilal TV. Hello, Khwezi, and thank you so much.
Hi, Quraysha, and hi to the viewers.
So, Khwezi, I want to start just with a quick analysis, and that is, coming to South Africa, we're 30 years down the line into this democracy. Many academics have still said that certainly it is not post-apartheid, but neo-apartheid, new forms of apartheid that have filtered into the system because apartheid itself, by its very nature in terms of the economy, the structure, the system, has not been eradicated. 30 years down the line, also, we've just had an election, and we see that, they say that liberation movements don't survive the third decade, and that seems to be the case with the ANC as well. It has lost a large chunk of its voters and is sitting at 40%. What do you make of this particular political context, and how do you see South Africa going forward as soon as the president announces his cabinet?
Yeah, I think it's important to I think just locate the elections.
Okay.
Sorry, the elections within this context of 30 years of democracy. And if you look at the areas of political and civil liberties, South Africa has made significant gains or achieved certain highlights in those areas, and that's even verified or authenticated by the ranking that South Africa has on different indices that look at political and civil liberties. But these political and civil liberties achievements have coexisted with the fact that if you look at the structure of South African society in terms of its socio-economic structure and access to employment, inequality, and all those different indicators, it's clear that we are still dealing with the tenets of basically the history of racial capitalism. And not only materially in terms of people's socioeconomic conditions, but also racism persists, right? So in different institutions as well outside the economy. So I think that's what has happened, and I think the reflections on the elections and what has happened needs to be located within that context of 30 years of democracy. And the reality is that the constituting of government and of the cabinet basically has to be a catalyst for implementing policies that address this sort of the structure of racial capitalism that persists and is still prevalent in society. Otherwise, we're headed towards a lot more conflict, instability, and that's not tenable or suitable. Yeah.
So, Khwezi, for the benefit of the audience, when you speak about racial capitalism, what do you mean exactly by that, and how is that still prevalent tangibly? If an ordinary person, a lay person, a housewife is sitting and listening to our conversation, how will she identify racial capitalism in South Africa, and how can she understand it?
Yeah. So apartheid wasn't just about political domination, okay? It was also about basically creating a segregated society and an uneven society. And at the heart of this was basically cheap labor, mostly, as you know, black cheap labor. Secondly, segregated and uneven development. So if you look at the differences between the development of the township, the rural areas, and the suburbs, which were mostly white, it was mostly uneven. Even in terms of the distribution of basic services and resources, it was mostly uneven. It was also about the fact that you exploit the basic minerals of the country, and you make sure that those minerals and those basic resources are used essentially to improve the livelihoods of certain segments of society, which are mostly white. Okay, so in other words, apartheid wasn't just about political domination; it was also about creating an economic system that subjugated the black population in its entirety. And so this is why even today, when you look at things like poverty, unemployment, inequality, they are still racialized in the sense that it is mostly black people who are experiencing those negative socioeconomic impacts. It is mostly black people that are excluded. And it's not just based on just only the question of race, but even if you look at deeper at the question of gender as well. So that's a basically simple explanation about racial capitalism. Yeah.
So there might be very many people who will argue that we are already 30 years into this democracy, and it has been headed by a party, a prominently and predominantly, should I rather say, black party, right? And they have had the opportunity to maybe change circumstances, address these issues, but you're saying they haven't. And people will then say, so why are we looking back? Why are we blaming apartheid? Why are we negative towards political parties such as the DA who want to govern and who want to govern for the benefit of South Africa? How would you respond to that?
So my response is that, remember, when we talk about racialized capitalism, we're looking at a system that existed for close to 4 centuries, essentially, through colonialism and apartheid as well. So the reality is that you can't undo those structural tenets within just a period of 30 years. You can make some gains within that year, but it's going to take you longer because you're dealing with the very structure of society. And then the reality is that the ANC-led government has implemented some redistributive social policies that have had positive gains. So, for example, if you look at access to education has improved, we can debate about the quality. There's some sections of the black population and have risen to the category of the middle class. Access to basic services has also improved. Again, we can debate about the nature of the quality. But these are just socially redistributive measures to ameliorate or the negative structural impacts of racial capitalism in society. But these have not really dealt with the underlying structure. And there you need, I think, more extensive policy shifts to do that. And that's where the ANC-led government, I think, hasn't really performed well. So, and this is why there's a big debate now about, okay, what do we do beyond just the housing, the access to water, the improved access to education? What do we do in order to change the very structure and makeup of the economy to deal with this racialized capitalism? That would be my response to that. Structural change takes time and needs adequate policy to implement it.
But besides adequate policy and time, you also need political will, right? Because there is the argument that we have some of the best policies in the world, but these are just not being implemented. And if they're not being implemented and we have the policies, then does that mean that perhaps we need a change of governance, a change in government, or a change in mindset and more ethical leadership?
Yeah, I'm not sure that we have the best policies in all areas, to be honest. I think there are some areas where we've had some of the good policies, so social security, access to basic services and the likes, right? Social protection, the social wage, essentially. Mm-hmm. But then there are other areas where I think we need to really rethink our policies. So, I mean, the fundamental principles of our macroeconomic policies and our framework that we've implemented over the 30 years haven't produced the desired result. We need to change the way that even Black economic empowerment has been understood, has been implemented. And it needs to be totally linked to restructuring the economy, not just integration into existing economic structures. we really need to review, I think, the role of the state in development as well. So there are a lot of areas where I think this idea of us having the best policies doesn't hold water. We need to change policy direction in a lot of areas to deal with basically the elements of racialized capitalism.
So,
No,
please go ahead.
Yeah. And I think that what has actually happened is that the results of the election are basically showing us that the policies that we've implemented, especially in the areas that I've spoken about, haven't produced the desired results. And people have decided not to vote, essentially. Mm-hmm. And that's the way of them protesting against those policies. And this is why I think the ANC is even losing traction with its own social base, which is largely made up of Black working class citizens. So I definitely think that we need some substantive changes in our policy orientation to address this issue.
So we have to go to a break, but when we come back from the break, I want to then go into an analysis of the election and the election results. But I would like you to first contextualize it for me in terms of South Africa's history. But we'll see you after the break. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the second segment with my very special guest, Khwezi Mabasa, who is the Economic and Social Policy Program Manager at Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. His work mainly focuses on labor studies, political economy and racial capitalism. And before we went on to the break, Khwezi very, in his good-naturedness, usually takes time to give an analysis, and he's usually spot on. Explain to us that although we have some performance, we have some progress, we have some good policies, there are others that need to be critiqued. And we can appreciate that when we can sit back and realize that, you know what, there's some things that are working, some things that are not working, and we really need to do something about that rather than to keep doing the same things over and over again and expect a different result. You know, they say that's madness. So, Khwezi, coming back to what you said actually before we went on to the break, we have the situation where we have, you know, a problem in terms of which the ideals, the aspirations, the dreams, the visions, the hopes of the nation has kind of shifted from a very big high in 1994 to a sense of despondency, perhaps even, you know, apathy, where you rightfully say that people don't want to come out and vote. We see that voter turnout is getting lesser with each successive election, and most significantly, it is the youth who are not coming out to vote. And yet, what happens in this country, the changes that we make and the way we take it forward ultimately impacts on the youth, because they are the present and they are the future. Now, if you look at the elections that, you know, have just passed us, May 29, how do you analyze the youth's response in terms of the political parties that they voted for?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's not a lot of information on the youth responses in terms of the political party that they voted for. What we do know is that the IEC had stated that in terms of the registration numbers, this is the highest number of young people that have managed to register for elections. But whether they actually did turn up or not, that's still something that needs to be discussed and investigated based on the data that comes out. But in terms of the university votes, especially in the Gauteng province, there we know that the EFF done quite well and they performed well in a number of universities. But remember that that's a particular segment of youth, right? That's youth that has access to higher education. So we don't know that that's representative of the entire youth population. But what we do know is that traditionally, young people don't really show up as much on the actual day of voting. So it'd be interesting to see that. But what we can definitely gauge from some of the election debates were that young people were agitating around important issues. So employment, better access to education. Some were even calling for a more participatory form of politics. There was issues around whether political parties really represent their interests, how they understand and interpret the world as well. But so I think the question of the youth vote is still something that's subject to debate. Besides the data that we have from what happened in institutes of higher education. Yeah.
So, if you look at the political parties across the spectrum, right, do you think that young people, though, are more inclined to respond to political parties who kind of look like them, represent them, speak like them, identify with them? So, political parties like the EFF, who have a younger cohort of politicians. If you look at Songezo Zibi's Rise Msanzi, has also brought in a whole lot of young people into the party. And then we have the MK, which was considerably, although they had Zuma's face on it, but there was a significant number of younger people. Do you think that ultimately, in the long run, this will impact on the effect, the influence, and the potential that these political parties will have?
So I think that when we speak about young people, I don't think that their voting behavior, their politics are just informed by the question of demographics in terms of age. I think there are other underlying issues, so related to the identity. So race plays a huge role, issues around gender. And if you look at the election results generally, we can see that race played a very significant role in the way that people voted for certain parties. So it's clear if you look at how many the racial demographics for support for the DA, the ANC, the PA, and the like. So race I think still plays a huge part there. And then the second thing also is that I think that young people are also, they have different ideologies, right, and different political perspectives. And so, again, that will also influence how they vote and who they identify themselves with, okay? And I think often what we do when we talk about young people is that we normally associate them with just a strata in society that mostly is influenced by who they connect with in terms of demographics. But I think there's just other issues around race and ideology that also influences how young people vote and how they also perceive politics. So what's interesting also is that a lot of young people are involved in civil society movements. So, and that's where they think they exercise most political influence. And sometimes that's in conversation with political parties themselves through advocacy. But if we look at the election results, I can think that, well, I wouldn't be convinced that the parties with the young or younger leadership were able to garner more votes in this election. I think that one can't really say that because, I mean, the EFF only received 10%. We know also that Rise and Zanzi also didn't perform that well. I think it was 1% or 2% also, so it wasn't really significant. And they have younger leaders. Yeah.
So your focus and most of your work is in terms of labor studies. How do you understand the labor sector? And if you look at the workers, the working movements, etc., the worker movements, etc., how have they responded to the elections and to the political parties that were out there campaigning in terms of trying to secure for themselves a position in South Africa? Do you think that the labor sector, the workers, the worker rights, etc., played a significant role? And have people been mobilized around these issues, especially in terms of your studies?
Yeah, so I think the main issue was from the labor perspective was looking at the different manifestos and what the parties were basically stating about the question of labor and labor rights. And I know there was a big criticism around the manifestos of parties like the DA, the IFP, and Action SA because they were basically arguing that South Africa's labor market is too rigid and it's not flexible and it's causing unemployment. So in other words, the trade unions are too strong and the labor laws are too strong and we need to change that. The second thing is that some parties were even coming out and openly saying in the manifestos that the blanket or the general application of the minimum wage is also an impediment to economic development and employment. So we need to have a system where we can, decrease the extent to which the minimum wage applies in different sectors and to different companies. So that was a big issue. And this particularly came out again, DA, the IFP stance. And then the whole debate around also employment equity was huge, because employment equity essentially deals with the labor market transformation, especially when it comes to race and gender demographics. And as we know, some of the parties were even saying that no, we shouldn't be using some of those categories as a key marker or form of regulatory tool to transform the labor market. So workers' engagement with elections was mostly around those important issues. And then the other one was also the debate about the budget, and the fiscal policy framework of the country, because some people are arguing that no, we just need to carry on implementing tight control measures around the budget, essentially spend less, and that might include even spending less on frontline services in the public service. And obviously that created a lot of criticism from the labor movement. And so what was interesting for me was to watch how the different labor organizations responded to those particular topical issues in these different manifestos. And even now, that's why COSATU, the biggest trade union federation in the country, has been very critical of the government of national unity because of the stance on labor market issues from political parties like the DA and the IFP. Yeah.
That is actually requires a whole discussion on its own, which I want to take forward in the next interview that we're having, which I'm going to continue with you. More specifically, I want your personal opinion, because I know there are tremendous debates around these issues, and people are saying that why should we have so much of regulatory control in terms of labor unions, in terms of fixed wages, or basic minimum income or basic minimum wages, things like that. People are not understanding these concepts. They're also not understanding why it is necessary. If you look at the history of South Africa and the huge disenfranchisement that the majority of black people have experienced, and they pin this down to the fact that the government has been ineffective, has been exceptionally corrupt, and people are saying, well, if the government was not so corrupt, people would have a better life. On the other hand, we are saying that we need certain policies to ensure that even if there is corruption, people still have some kind of dignity, something to help them, because you're walking on crutches, you need some kind of a help. So very quickly, in 30 seconds, Khwezi, if you can just give us a final note before we end this particular program, and we'll come back and take those two discussions further in the next segment.
Yeah. So when I spoke about racial capitalism, I said one of the characteristics is the cheap black labor system. So the attack on labor laws and transforming the labor market is basically an attempt to sustain that. And the policy debates around minimum wage, employment equity, are all supposed to transform that cheap black labor system. So that's why it's so central. And we know that labor market inequality accounts for 70% of inequality in society. Yeah.
Okay, so thanks. Thanks a million for that. I will definitely bring up the questions again, but I'm hoping that most of you who are listening today will be eager to follow this discussion further with us in the next interview. But for the insights that Khwezi has given us now, we say thank you very much, and we'll see you next week. Fi amanillah, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.